HumanX Ventures presents Inside the Coaching Mind. Terry Pettit coached the University of Nebraska's first national championship team in 1995 and put the state of Nebraska on a path to volleyball greatness. Now, Terry mentors coaches, writes books, and gives talks about leadership and team building to corporate and business audiences. Here's Coach Pettit to take us inside the coaching mind.
Thank you, David Young, our producer, and also thank you to HumanX Ventures. As you know, HumanX is an organization that hires, mentors, trains, and develops extraordinary coaches and leaders. And we have a person that certainly fits that category as our guest today. Brad Ott is a great friend, and he's been part of my team for 20 years now. Has a great business in Northern Colorado, Rebound Sports Therapy. Brad's from Iowa. He was a competitor in college. He has a son and a daughter that were elite competitors in college, and we're going to talk about that. But when I began coaching in the early 1970s, the college that I coached at did not even have a trainer. Now, every university has all types of support people that are as critical as the coaching staff in preventing injuries and sometimes helping people work through a rehab following surgeries. Brad Ott, welcome to Inside the Coaching Mind. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're also a great entrepreneur. When I first met you, it seemed like you were in a basement over in Loveland, and now you have three wonderful facilities, one in Loveland, two in Fort Collins, and you've got a large team of physical therapists. So a lot of things have changed, and I have to think there's a tremendous demand for what you do. And it's not just elite athletes, but it's people that need to walk after surgery. You mentioned to me the other day, and maybe people will be surprised about this, but the number one client today is somebody who picked up pickleball after not doing anything for 40 years.
That's right.
Let's begin about where you grew up, how you got into sports, and how you decided to be a physical therapist.
Yeah, so I grew up in Northeast Iowa, small town. At the young age, kind of like everybody else, played every sport, just cycled through the year. Played 3 to 4 sports in high school. Had the opportunity to go on and play college football. During that, I was looking at going to medical school. So I was in a pre-med type program. Had several injuries, a few surgeries, and worked a lot with physical therapists, and started to realize that maybe that might be a better calling. And so the last year in school, I took the MCATs and the stuff to go to school, but decided to go the route of physical therapy. Went down to Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis and got my PT degree from there, and knew right away that I wanted to get involved with athletes and work with them. Didn't see it turning out like it has now on some of the things we've evolved to, but have enjoyed that ride.
What's the biggest change from when you began in the 90s to today? What's the biggest change in what a physical therapist does and the type of clients that you see?
Yeah, I think within the field of physical therapy, the scope of what that profession can add to our community and society is just much broader. You have pediatric stuff, you have geriatric, you have neurologic. It's very widespread. I pretty much spend my time in the orthopedic world and sports medicine world, but it's certainly its benefit to our society has expanded. Clinically, I think we could all appreciate this as athletes and coaches. It used to be if you had something that was sore or injured or tight, especially if it was tight, what would be the one thing that you would be told to do if it was tight?
Probably a static stretch.
To stretch it, exactly. And over the years, we've learned that there's a role for stretching and a time and place for it. but the body is sometimes protecting other things, and that's why it does not allow us to have that range of motion. So there's a fundamental shift in the way we view limited range of motion or tightness. So that and many other aspects of the clinical sciences has changed in the many years that I've been doing this.
Well, Brad, we had trainers when I was coaching at Nebraska, but I actually went outside the department and contacted physical therapists. One was Pete Agoscu in California. We had an
Right.
athlete, Chris Hall, and our training staff told us that she would never play again. And my assistant coach at the time, John Cook, was from San Diego, had worked with Pete. Pete is somebody who came back, I believe, from Vietnam and had
Correct.
all kinds of injuries and rehabilitated himself and started a clinic called the Agoscu Method. Chris went out there and was there for 3 days and came back, and she did a couple hours of therapy a day and was an All-American, and then won the heptathlon and track without even training for it.
Right.
And then a man named Ron Hruska, who you know.
Yep.
And the difference, I think, in both of those people was they were thinking not just about how do we fix something, but how do we prevent something. And so they changed what we did. And I know you both know both those gentlemen.
Yep.
Talk about any impact they might have had on you.
Well, Egoscue is something I studied. I just came along it and read his book or books, and really found it interesting that he was going after some very deep-seated postural imbalances, like a volleyball player may have, a golfer, or anybody that does an asymmetrical sport. Really found his stuff to be fascinating. Ron Hruska out of Nebraska fundamentally changed my clinical life in the way I looked at patients with some really, really deep-seated ideas of how the nervous system and our breathing systems all integrate together. And again, just totally changed my viewpoint on that. And I've enjoyed the challenges of trying to integrate some of their work into our daily practice.
Well, I want you to talk a little bit about that. I had Ron come in. I used to run a coaches roundtable, and he came in, and I asked a couple coaches to bring in athletes. Ron did
Right.
not know them. And one was a female basketball player. And he just looked at her and said, "You have trouble moving to your left, don't you, on defense?" And she said, yeah, I do. My observation would be this, and I had elite athletes. I've never seen an athlete, never coached an athlete who moved this exceptionally well in all directions. In other words, they moved to their right, they moved to the left, they might have been able to move forward, but they didn't move particularly well going backwards. What is there what causes that? What's happening if someone can move well in one direction and not another direction?
Yeah, so when we study human movement, we look at it as what we call triplanar. So we can, as you said, we can move forward, we can move back, we can move right, we can move left, and then we've also got rotary motion, right? And so with the body, we have inherent patterns of how we operate, whether we're reaching for something in the cupboard or whether we're swinging a golf club. We develop these patterns for a variety of reasons, and I don't know anybody that has studied it more in depth than Ron and his institute. That doesn't mean I'm going to get injured. It does mean that I'm going to use different movement strategies to do those things. So just as you found with Ron taking a look at that athlete in a short time saying, might be able to go front and back very, very well, but can't go right and left, and particularly to one side. So those patterns are hardwired into us. It's not something that is just a tightness of tissue. It's very neurologically based on how they move.
Yeah. And, when we say neurologically based, one of the stories I frequently share is that an athlete can't learn to throw much past puberty, the neurological pathways have been pruned. So you can't just go out if you've never thrown and start throwing with your opposite hand at 20 years old and get any arm speed. It's not a muscle issue. It's a neurological pathway issue. So
Sure.
let's say that somebody comes in and they have some limitations with a throwing motion. They're okay, but it's not great. How would you evaluate what's going on with them and figure out how they might get better?
Right. That's another part that's really changed in sports medicine and physical therapy. It's fundamentally different if I'm seeing someone and evaluating them for a pain issue.
Right.
If we have a pain issue, we're chasing that kind of crime scene and trying to figure out, okay, why is that pain there? How are we going to decrease inflammation? With my Ready, Set, Go program, we're looking at athletes who don't necessarily have pain. We're just looking at how they move, how their nervous system is integrating with their muscular system to see if we can find dysfunctions that either one are going to relate to decreased performance or two, higher injury potential. So we're going to look at that from several different angles or methodologies and kind of look and see what is there that we could kind of address with that athlete.
Well, we'll go through the three stages. What's ready?
Well, just like you'd say, starting a track race, on your marks, get set, go. The idea with Ready, Set, Go is you're at the starting line. And, we've talked about this of kids that are playing sports year round. It's the same movement pattern. It's the same sport versus kids that are doing multiple sports and different movement patterns. So, the risk factors are going to be different with all of them. And also in testing, I'm going to test a volleyball player completely different than I'm going to test a cross country runner because the demands of the sport are different. So, you have to have a little sport specificity along with, the individual testing specificity.
But there are some movements that are similar. So
Sure.
There's a throwing motion in golf. There's a
Yep.
throwing motion in even hitting a baseball. You know, we were just average jumpers in my family, but my brother took his son when he was about, I think, a freshman in high school, and he put him on a box, and he started with the rim at 9 feet, and Chip would jump off the box and dunk the ball, and he just kept raising it. So he was doing depth jumps. And by the time, he got to be a junior in high school, he's dunking the ball on a rim. Now, is this just dumb luck, or what happened there?
Well, I think that is a testament to what we call in medicine or in the body and physiology. That's a little bit of neuroplasticity, that our bodies are quite capable of developing different channels of neural circuitry, strength, power, speed. We're very adaptable as humans to do a lot of those things. So I don't think that's just dumb luck. I think that they kind of came upon it in a way in which every time you move that rim a little bit higher, there's also a motivational factor to kind of get there. So,
But the depth jump, could that have been harmful if he started it earlier?
You could ask that question for sure. At what age do you start to load these young kiddos, and are their tissues and bones and ligaments, are they ready for that?
Yeah. I know with both of our daughters, we used to go out and play catch, and then we would play long toss at the end. Every time we played catch, we might play catch twice a week, but we would play long toss and try and throw the ball harder and further. And, they weren't going to be softball players, but I felt it would be critical in the sport of volleyball. The most important predictor. Billy Glisson and I had this talk the other day, and you probably know Billy, but Billy teaches arm speed, and he's worked with the Denver baseball team. But you have to develop arm speed by a certain point, And the greatest predictor whether or not a kid is going to play high school volleyball is arm speed. If you're 5'6" and you have great arm speed, you can play high school volleyball. Blocking is not, really doesn't have an impact on high school volleyball. But if you don't have that, even if you're much taller, you're going to have difficulty doing that. So it would seem like there are some basic movements that every kid ought to be learning, in elementary school. And
Right.
what are some of the, beyond arm speed, what else do we have to learn in terms of movement patterns to be healthy?
Well, I think there's a number of them. When we see now in sports the ground reaction forces, that's a big one. We could use golf and look at the current high level golfers and tour players and how much power they generate off the ground. And so for me, that's a lot of rotary power. That's using hips, pelvis, core, and integrating that movement pattern. It's not how big, as you said, how big their muscles are. It's how efficient is their movement pattern within that motion, right? So I think another one is could be foot speed and ground reaction time. How quickly can an athlete go in from a shock absorption phase when they land on a single leg into a propulsion phase? That's less time on the ground. That's increased speed. It's kind of similar to what you're talking about with arm speed, right?
So yeah, and that's why, in our warm up to volleyball, we used to do some bounding off one foot. I'm curious, back to the golf. You see these slow motion videos and you see Tiger Woods or Rory squatting, but I mean, can the average adult, even healthy adult, do that without being injured?
In my opinion, yes. But if we're taking someone who's just spent 20 years at a desk sitting in a chair, you have to kind of reestablish that motor sequence or the movement sequence of how do I actually rotate and squat and store energy. But if that person has played sports at a young age, and even if it's not golf, you can tap into those movement patterns that they had from baseball or another sport and kind of bring that into a more efficient pattern for golf, for sure.
Well,
And I would argue that might correlate to them not being injured.
Okay. Well, as you know, I've had spinal fusion on L4, L5, S1. I shouldn't be squatting, should I?
Well, it depends on what type of squat we're talking about. If we're talking about putting a heavy, set of weights on your back, the answer is no, because that's going to load your axial spine, and that's not, the risk reward there is not very good. But if we're talking about body weight and learning how to hinge into a hip without heavy loads, that's something you functionally should be able to do, whether you're outside picking up sticks in the yard or in the garage or swinging a golf club. So I would argue that unless there's something that is, very serious to precaution for that should be a goal, to be able to squat or squat and rotate and do those functional movements.
When an athlete comes into your office and you first look at them, what are the first 3 or 4 things that you look at to see what might be an issue?
Let me go back real quick, Terry, to when Ron Huruska, when they brought the athlete in front of him. Did he put them on the table and do any tests before he made the declaration that she couldn't move to the left, or did he just kind of look at her posturally?
No, I think he asked her to do a couple things.
Okay. So right away, when I'm looking at an athlete, I had one this morning, I'm watching the way that they get up from the chair in the waiting room. I'm watching the way they walk back to the room. Do they swing their arms the same? Is their torso rotation the same? So I'm taking data in right away for sure. And then I'm going to have a series of tests that I think have a high probability of giving me good data. So if I were to say to you, okay, you got 15 minutes with a prospective volleyball player, you got only 15 minutes. What are the 5 things you want to see him do? Well, I think similar to me, you're going to have your top things that will give you the most data in the shortest bit of time, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, so, so to your point, even if I'm looking at somebody with a knee injury or an elbow injury, I jokingly tell them, what I would have liked the front desk to do is to remove both your arms and legs and bring you back to the treatment room so I can examine your main car frame, like your chassis, and that's your pelvis, your rib cage, because if that's twisted, per Ron Huruska and the PRI Institute, if that's out of balance, when we put the appendages on, we're going to see asymmetry of range of motion. And so I'm always curious right away of do we have a significant imbalance there? Because that's going to affect the rest of the limbs, arms and legs.
Right. If can you, I mean, if let's say that you go evaluate a basketball team, somebody asks you to come in and run players through a series of tests. When I grew up, we used to say that when you look at sprinters, their toes tend to be inverted. They tend to be, if anything, more pigeon-toed. And yet, I've seen exceptional basketball players that were kind of splay-footed. But in general, would we prefer an athlete whose toes were moving forward, slightly inverted with the weight inside? Is it a deal breaker if we see somebody whose toes are pointed out at 45 degrees?
Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't call it a deal breaker because you can see incredible athletes with different presentations. You could look at John Elway as very kind of toe in walking gait, and you can look at another athlete, as you said, that's more splayed out or duck footed that is also good. That's just one measure. I will tell you that if I see asymmetry in those two things, one foot is going straight down the hallway and the other foot is duck footed, that's going to make me go, there's something going on here. So there's a little clue. But
they're probably walking around in a circle.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, but it's funny. Sometimes when you go and ask some other questions like, hey, do you ski? Like, yeah, I do ski. Do you have problems turning to your right? How do you know that? How do you know that I've always struggled turning my skis to the right with my left ski on the downhill side? So there are predictors of how they can't really integrate those movements. And it doesn't mean they can't ski. It's just not as proficient to go one way. Same thing with a running back. They may go around right end really well and cut up field, but around the left side, they just don't cut with the same explosiveness upfield, going off the left leg.
Well, I've skied very little, but I do know this. I can turn to my left. I'm much less confident turning to my right. I always attributed that to being a basketball player who did things off their left leg. I shot lay-ins off my left leg. When I play golf, I post off the left leg. I mean, is there anything to that you become more dependent on one leg than the other?
Sure. Going all the way back to the patterns, our brain and a lot of our physiology is asymmetrical, right?
Yeah.
To your point, though, you just mentioned that you had a harder time turning to your left on the ski.
No, to my right. I have a harder time
turning to your right.
Yes. Right. Which means I'm
okay,
putting
so
more
when you
of a
turn
load
right,
on that right foot.
Yeah, so that's where you get into the whole biomechanics thing of like, is this a learned thing or is there something, deeper physiologically that's asymmetrical that's kind of driving that? So, and those are, I find those things fascinating because when you're looking at movement and quality of movement, whether we're talking skiing or volleyball, and you don't have pain to chase, now you really have to go deep to really find the things. If they just have knee pain or shoulder pain, all the attention is going to go right to the pain issue, right? But when we're talking about quality of movement, efficiency of movement, now you have to take in a whole lot of things, in consideration.
So if we don't want static stretching, before we begin an athletic event. Does that mean that
I
the
think
guy?
that's,
Go ahead.
well, I think that's fairly safe to say that a static stretch, or where your teammate, is stretching your leg or whatever, in that passive mode, that tends to inhibit some of the neural signals to that muscle temporarily. It doesn't do any damage in that cell phone reception. I talk a lot about the nervous system having good cell phone reception with individual muscles and groups of muscles. And our body can dampen that neural signal, just like losing some bars of cell phone reception. So no, I wouldn't have an athlete do a static stretch immediately before a competition. I would rather they do something dynamic to facilitate or activate or wake up their neuromuscular system.
Which would be like what?
Could be any kind of things. It depends on the sport. For a golfer, it might be doing just some simple balance drills or waking up their deep core abs before they practice. There's a whole variety of ways you can do that.
Uh-huh. You mentioned to me when I asked you what sport was the sport that you saw the most today, and it was a surprise. I think it would surprise most people. But what client do you see more than any other client?
Well, in our outpatient clinics, it has turned over into pickleball. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. I should be building pickleball courts maybe because it's a great driver to outpatient physical therapy.
And what's the reason behind it?
Well, I think there's several. Pickleball may come to people who years gone by used to play tennis. They might have played racquetball, some other racket sport. And now we all of a sudden have that as an option. Smaller court. But the issue for some of these people is that 20 years has passed since they have regularly, challenged their nervous system to get to a ball, to move quickly. And so, like all of us say when we get a little older, my brain thought I could get to that ball. My body had other intentions. And because I lurched real hard, I tore my Achilles, or I fell and then, tore up my rotator cuff. So again, our brains think we can move at a certain speed, but a few years under the belt kind of slows our reaction times down, and that's where we get an injury. And certainly some pickleballers, they don't just go play for 20, 30 minutes. They'll play for several hours, and there you get into a fatigue issue as well, and you can get some overuse injuries besides just traumatic injuries.
There's a separation I find in my brain in what my brain thinks I can do and what I can no longer do. I run into even in fly fishing. I'll be in the river where you need to step from one rock to another. Mm-hmm. And it's something I could do 30 years ago, but my brain still thinks I can do it. And exactly. I can't. So I really have to. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have the same problem at a buffet. I think I can eat that much, but I can't pull it off, and then I got to go lay down for a couple hours.
Yeah. Well, I saw a study the other day where somebody took a group of pitchers and had them all pitch like a 60-pitch game. So they took a break between innings. They threw 60 pitches, and then they measured their range of motion and strength. And immediately following the activity, the range of motion, they had decreased about 18%. But the next day, the range of motion was 25% less. And the next day, the strength was considerably less, close to 25%. It took 4 days for somebody who threw 60 pitches to completely recover their strength and range of motion. And we've got a lot of people that coach and play volleyball that listen to this. So the question is, it's not unusual for somebody to go in and have 60 attacks in a volleyball match.
Hmm.
My question is, should that person not be attacking the day before? And should they, if, how do we prepare them if they have to play two matches in a row? We wouldn't ask a Major League Baseball player to, to throw 60 pitches 2 days in a row. But we're asking
Right.
we're asking some high school athletes to play three matches in a day.
Right.
How do we, so is hitting a volleyball easier on the shoulder than throwing a baseball? And if so, why?
Well, first of all, this whole category, the question you're bringing up is exactly the part that's fascinating to me, because how much of that is, if we took that group of pitchers, how many of them had imbalances even before they did the test, and what was their training going into that? As a general rule of thumb, what you're seeing in the 2, 3, 4 days afterwards is the nervous system is dampening access to those tissues and to those muscles as a way to protect. Our brain is primarily in survival mode for a lot of things that we do. And so its first thing is going to protect. If I sprain my ankle 5 days ago and today I wake up and I say, today I'm not going to limp. As soon as I step on the floor and those pain fibers come up and are processed by my nervous system, my brain, my body is going to dampen that and I will go into a limp. So you got to remember that there's a nervous system, component to this. It's not just they need more muscle. Okay. As far as your question about is a baseball pitch any more strenuous than serving a volleyball? Again, I think it depends on the individual. It depends on mechanics. There's a lot going on. In baseball, the one advantage they have is they have a stable surface to push off of. And so they can generate power from the mound or from the ground up. What I find fascinating about volleyball is those athletes in the air have to internally develop an anchor system to generate power from. They don't have contact with the ground. And so fundamentally, it's a very different sequencing. Even though the overall movement might look somewhat the same, how they generate that force is definitely different.
Yeah, and volleyball coaches, and including my own experience, find we feel more stress on the shoulder serving than we do spiking, because with the serve, we stop the motion with impact at the ball. We kind of pop it, so it doesn't necessarily fall to the
Mm-hmm.
floor. Does that in itself create
Right.
more stress?
I think it does. The other thing is that just like a person that is a distance runner, Terry, when they do the exact same mechanical motion over and over, like a serve, there aren't huge variations there. Whereas if they're at the net spiking a ball, they're coming from different angles. It's not always the exact same sequence of movements and angles. So there's a little bit more variety there. Whereas a serve like a golf swing is going to be fairly consistent.
Right. Well, I think you're hinting at something here too, that we run a much higher risk of injury if we just keep doing the same activity over and over. So in volleyball, we run the slide, most effective attack in volleyball. A player runs parallel to the net, jumps off one foot, rotates their hips, their shoulder, their elbow, their wrist in the air, and then lands. But we don't train them running the other way. It's only one way.
Right.
And 15, 20
Right.
years ago, we had a rash of ACL injuries, uh, partly because people didn't know how to land. They didn't know how to land and stick their butt out. You watch the NBA, these guys knock each other all over the place, but they land usually and stick their butt out and kind of cushion the landing. And then, of course, they've got massage therapists, physical therapists, people working on their body so that they can play the next day. But it to me, it's fascinating. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, if you had an ACL, people tried to have that person play 9 months later. Klay Thompson on the Warriors has an ACL injury, and he sits out 2 years before he comes back. Now, he may have had some other issues, but it looks to me like that people understand the healing process it takes longer than what we were originally trying to do. I mean, some football teams would try and get somebody back in 6 months. What do you think about all that?
Well, I'll go back to one thing you just said about the person that can land. You mentioned the phrase "stick their butt out." To me, I look at that as saying they took shock absorption through the hip and the pelvis.
Right.
If they don't take that shock absorption or that torque through the hip and the pelvis well, what's the next joint below? Is going right to their knee, right?
Right.
So, yeah, to your point, that is a clue that the hip and the pelvis, or butt out, is part of that shock absorption. As it relates to the injuries and the rehab time, we certainly have learned a lot, both from failure and success in the orthopedic world and sports medicine. So structurally, tissues may be healed. If you go and look at a tissue under a microscope, under an MRI, after an ACL, those tissues may be structurally sound after the surgery, but that doesn't equate for how they're moving and how well and how efficient their muscular system stabilizes that repaired joint. And so we recognize that sometimes at that 9-month mark and beyond is that there's a lot of neuromuscular training, proprioceptive training that has to occur. I know you've seen this type of athlete where you hear the report that this football player or other sport athlete, everyone says they're ahead of schedule early on. Well, it's ahead of schedule with range of motion, ahead of schedule with, their strength and how much weight they can move. And then you see them come out and you go, yeah, something's different. They aren't moving well. Is that a mental confidence thing? Is it the nervous system holding them back? We see that all the time. And some of those, unfortunately, will re-tear because it was too soon. So, yeah, the science on that continues to evolve, whether we're talking about elbows, shoulders, knees.
Right. Yeah. When I was a little league pitcher or little league catcher, I can remember my dad wouldn't let our pitchers throw a curveball. He felt that they just weren't physically strong enough to handle that. I see the same thing in club volleyball, where club volleyball coaches have kids running this slide when they're 12, 14 years old. And so they're going off one foot, very dynamic move. And they're not, in my mind, they shouldn't be teaching that then. They should be teaching to go off 2 feet, jumping up straight, coming down, hitting a high ball, which in the long run makes them a better volleyball player.
Right. So in my world, Terry, what I call that is we just gave that athlete a 400 level class at the university, and they haven't passed their 100, 200 level classes yet. We took them neurologically above their pay grade when they could have benefited from some more fundamental movements, right?
Right.
And so I'll share with you a quick story. In a Ready, Set, Go screening we had with a club soccer team, we had a young girl, and we have 5 different stations. Each station is testing a different, component of their body. And she was at the dynamic station where they had to do single leg bound for speed. So she had to cover a certain distance as fast as she could on a single leg. And she went on her right leg first, I believe, and looked really athletic. She got off the ground really quick. They went to do the test on the left side, and the therapist just about stopped the test after just even 3 or 4 bounds. When we combined the information of just looking how poorly she was on her left leg with the other stations, we went and actually grabbed the parents and wanted to talk about this because that was a red flag. this kid's going to be highly susceptible to an ACL injury, if not something else. And mom and dad just started nodding, and I was curious of why they did that. And they said her two older sisters have had two ACLs already on the same knee already in their sports career. So you can test for these things and those asymmetries. But imagine if that girl was doing a slide, the slide drill, and really not learning how to integrate that movement efficiently. So that's where you could say, is that more of a performance issue, or is that an injury prevention issue? And the answer is yes to both.
Yeah. This is kind of an offbeat question. I have a very good friend, lives down in North Carolina. He's my age, and he goes out every morning and he does earthing, meaning he's walking around in the grass without any shoes on. When he plays golf, he wears these shoes that are called barefoot shoes, and he hits the ball really well. He also does blocked breathing. Well, and where you inhale, hold the breath for so long, then exhale. Is this just kind of stuff like that voodoo, or are there I'm worried.
Well, I mean, you have a lot of people who talk about, if you're traveling and the first thing you should do when you get somewhere is get your shoes off and get grounded, with your bare feet on the ground and things like that. You could also find a big population that says, hey, our feet were designed to be mobile, adaptable, to be able to walk across sticks and stones and on hard surfaces, but we put our feet in wall-to-wall carpeting. And
Right.
So, we don't have that ability with our feet and things like that. To the breathing thing, as you know, with Ron Haruska and the PRI Institute, when we're correcting out asymmetries of the rib cage, breathing is a huge component. We do that 26,000 times a day. And if my breathing is dysfunctional, how I get air in, how I get air out, that is going to affect a lot of things. The first thing it's going to affect is it can affect my nervous system, my sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So if you had an important putt, or if an athlete had a big free throw, right before you make that putt or shoot the free throw, what would a sports psychologist tell you to do with your breath? Take a big breath in, or a good breath in and a good exhale?
Yeah, and I got a question about that. Should that breath in be done through the nose or through the mouth? And the reason I asked that is that I read a couple weeks ago that when we breathe in through the nose, it is a more comforting breath. That when we breathe through our mouth, it's kind of like we're gasping for air. When we breathe in through the nose, it's a little bit more comforting. So if I'm shooting a free throw, do I really want to go, or any thoughts on that?
Well, my thought is biased because I live in the clinical world and I'm dealing with people that are under pain and a lot of stress. And there are many, many articles and books on breath and breathing techniques and what you're trying to do. But my point is that if I have an important putt or a free throw or serve to make, when we take a big breath in and it's sudden, that stimulates my sympathetic nervous system. That's my fight or flight nervous system, and it actually ramps up my nervous system. When we do a big exhale, just like if you got to the edge of the beach watching a sunset, you're nice and relaxed and you just let that air go, that brings us into a parasympathetic relaxed state, which is a better operating module for something when we're under pressure. As far as the breath in through the nose, in our exercises, a corrective exercise, we have them take it in through the nose. Number one, the nasal passage provides moisture to the air. The other one is that mouth breathing alone changes some of the dynamics of breath work. So again, I'm biased because of my clinical background and what I'm seeing every day in the clinic, but I tend to have people do that. I will say though, if a person, does a good job with their breathing and exaggerates the exhale sometimes, that's very beneficial on multiple levels.
That's why I only bet in golf against mouth breathers.
Right.
I want to talk a little about your son. AJ played golf at Colorado State. He's kind of on an adventure for the last couple of years where he's testing satellite tours. How has he responded to his dad being a physical therapist? Do you do do you do periodic evaluations of his biomechanics and etc.?
I would say going back, because he grew up around the Colorado State program, and so he had access to PGA Tour Pro Martin Laird and other great players at CSU. He got to see some of the work that we've done with them for 25 years. There were times where, yes, we would definitely test him, but kind of like his golf game, I never put a schedule to hey, you need to go practice, you need to go have lessons. I just didn't, that wasn't my style, and I didn't think it was going to equate to maybe what he wanted to get to with me hounding him for that. So I guess I would consider myself at this point, I'm kind of in the bullpen. If he needs me, we have a conversation and I'll test things out. But I certainly don't drive that or push that. It's more on a, when he needs me, I'll be there.
Yeah. Last question I've got for you, Brad, is more of a question for an entrepreneur. How were you able to grow your business? How were you able to move from, yourself in a basement to what you've done today and still maintain the same quality?
Yeah, so it was myself, an aide technician, and then a person at the front desk, and now we're at, I think, just over 40 employees or somewhere in there, maybe 23 to 24 therapists. I would say it has a lot to do with just like sports teams. I've always looked for people with high character first, because I think character wins out over egos and greed, and they're good teammates. And so I've been very careful about who comes onto our team. I'd rather not have just a warm-bodied person. I want someone that contributes to what we're doing. I do a lot of studying and reading outside of the world of physical therapy. We used to say we're looking for that next person who has the it factor. And I didn't know what it was. I just knew if they had it, they would be a great, practitioner or teammate to the company. I think in the last, 5-10 years, I've figured out a little bit more of what that it thing is. And if you're familiar with emotional intelligence or EQ, those people they're number one, they're really good at self-awareness. They're really good at self-management. And when they have those skills, they then have awareness of the rest of their team, their teammates, their clients. And at that point, they can become influential people, opinion leaders, teachers, coaches, which is, in physical therapy, we're all of the above and psychologists on any given day. But if they don't have those fundamental EQ principles, they'll kind of be stuck at that level. And so I see a lot of similarities to really effective sports teams. Sometimes they aren't the most talented across the board, but they play well together and they win.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly well said. That's a great answer. And Brad, I want to thank you for the work you've done with me, and also thank you for this podcast. I think it's very informative, and hopefully we've got a lot of club coaches listening out there, and they'll consider some of the observations and suggestions that you made. I want to thank David Young, our producer, and I also want to thank HumanX Ventures. Without HumanX, we couldn't continue to do this. And everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Inside Mind is presented by HumanX Ventures and is pleased to be a part of the Learfield Varsity Podcast Network. If you're on Facebook, look for the Inside the Coaching Mind group and join a vibrant discussion of volleyball and leadership. TerryPettit.com is where you'll find Terry's books, writings, and downloads, as well as subscription links for all your podcast apps.